In April 1925, Britain made a decision that was meant to restore its pride, not its prosperity, not its people, but its image. 7 years after the guns of the First World War fell silent, Britain was exhausted, indebted, and quietly terrified of its own decline. The empire still stretched across the map in imperial red, but beneath the surface, something had gone badly wrong. The country that once financed the world was now struggling to finance itself. Yet in London, among bankers, treasury officials, and politicians, there was a shared belief almost, a fixation that Britain's problems were not structural, they were temporary. A distortion caused by war, and like any distortion, it could be corrected by returning to normal. That normal had a name: gold. Before the war, the British pound had been the anchor of the global financial system. It was trusted, stable, and most importantly convertible. Anyone, anywhere could exchange pounds for gold at a fixed rate. This simple promise gave Britain extraordinary power. Trade flowed through London. Loans were priced in sterling. The pound was not just a currency, it was a symbol of authority. But the war had broken that promise. To fight Germany, Britain had printed money on a scale never seen before. Gold reserves were drained, inflation followed. When peace came, the pound no longer commanded respect. It floated weakly against the dollar, a visible reminder that Britain was no longer what it had been. To the men who governed Britain, this weakness was unbearable. They did not see the falling pound as an economic signal. They saw it as a moral failure, a stain on national honor, proof that Britain had lost discipline, credibility, and control. And so, in 1925, they resolved to fix it. Britain would return to the gold standard, not at a new, realistic rate, not adjusted for the devastation of war, but at the old pre-war rate, as if the last decade had never happened. It was a decision driven by pride, nostalgia, and fear of American dominance. New York was rising, London was slipping, and gold, they believed, would put things back in their rightful place. What they did not understand, what they refused to understand, was that the world had changed, and by trying to restore the past, Britain was about to strangle its own future. When Britain returned to the gold standard in 1925, the pound did not simply regain its old value, it was forced to wear it. Before the war, one British pound was worth $4.86. That exchange rate had reflected an economy at the height of its power-efficient factories, dominant exports, and vast overseas investments generating steady income. But the Britain of the mid-1920s was no longer that country. Its industrial base had aged, its export markets had shrunk, its debts had exploded. Yet by restoring the pre-war rate, Britain artificially overvalued its currency by roughly 10%. On paper, the pound looked strong. In reality, it was crushing the economy beneath it. A strong currency makes imports cheaper, but exports more expensive. For a nation dependent on selling coal, steel, ships, and textiles abroad, this was catastrophic. British goods were suddenly priced out of global markets, not because they were inferior, but because the exchange rate made them unaffordable. A ton of British coal that had been competitive in Europe now cost significantly more than German or Polish coal. Steel from Sheffield struggled to compete with American production. Textile mills in Lancashire found their traditional buyers turning elsewhere, and this pressure did not fall evenly. London's financial sector applauded the policy. Bankers, bondholders, and rentiers benefited from a strong pound. Their savings gained value, their international standing was restored. But in the industrial heartlands, the coal fields of Wales, the shipyards of Scotland, the factories of northern England, the impact was brutal and immediate. Orders dried up, margins collapsed, layoffs followed. Unemployment began to rise, not in a sudden crash, but in a slow, grinding climb that hollowed out entire communities. By the mid-1920s, more than 1 million men were out of work, many of them veterans promised a better future after the war. The government's response was chillingly detached. Treasury officials argued that pain was necessary. Wages had to fall, prices had to fall. Britain, they insisted, needed internal deflation to match its new currency reality. The economy would be squeezed until it fit the pound rather than the pound adjusted to fit the economy. This logic treated workers as variables, communities as collateral damage, and it rested on one dangerous assumption: that markets would eventually correct themselves if discipline was enforced long enough. But discipline without demand is starvation. And as Britain soon discovered, A currency cannot thrive when the economy beneath it is being slowly suffocated. As the pound strengthened, something else weakened, just as predictably, the lives of ordinary Britons. To make an overvalued currency work, costs had to fall across the economy. And in an industrial society, the largest cost was always labor. Wages were not merely an economic variable, they were the pressure valve through which the gold standard enforced its discipline. Employers, already struggling with shrinking export orders, began demanding wage cuts. In coal, steel, textiles, and shipbuilding, workers were told they must accept lower pay and longer hours or lose their jobs entirely. The message was clear. British labor had to become cheaper to compensate for the artificially strong pound. This was not an accident, it was policy. Treasury officials believed unemployment was a necessary corrective. If enough men were out of work, wages would fall naturally. If wages fell, British goods would become competitive again. It was a theory that treated human suffering as a tool of adjustment. By the mid-1920s, entire regions were sinking into permanent depression. In mining towns, joblessness became generational. Families lived on minimal relief, often selling furniture, tools, even clothing to survive. Promises made to returning soldiers, homes fit for heroes, rang hollow in streets filled with boarded-up houses and idle men. The social consequences were explosive. Trade unions, once cooperative during the war, hardened their stance. They saw clearly that the burden of sound money was falling almost entirely on workers, while financiers remained insulated. Resentment spread not only toward employers, but toward the state itself. And yet, the government did not reconsider. For policymakers, abandoning the gold standard was unthinkable. To devalue the pound would be to admit failure. Worse, it would signal weakness to international markets. Prestige mattered more than stability. Honor mattered more than employment. The gold standard had become a moral cause. Supporters framed the crisis in ethical terms. A strong currency meant discipline. A weak currency meant decadence. Inflation was treated as a national sin. Unemployment as unfortunate but purifying. This mindset left no room for compromise. When workers resisted wage cuts, they were portrayed as obstacles to recovery. When unions threatened action, they were accused of undermining national stability. The language of economics blended seamlessly into the language of moral judgment. By 1925, Britain was no longer facing a technical economic problem. It was facing a class confrontation driven by a monetary system that demanded obedience at all costs. And the stage was set for a conflict that would test whether a democracy could survive when its government chose to defend a symbol over its people. The breaking point came from the ground beneath Britain's feet. Coal was not just another industry, it was the foundation of the British economy. It powered factories, heated homes, fueled ships, and underpinned exports. When coal failed, everything else followed. By 1925, British coal was in crisis. The return to the gold standard had pushed prices up overnight in foreign markets. A currency decision made in London had instantly erased the narrow profit margins of coal owners. Every ton exported now sold at a loss. Mine owners responded in the only way the system allowed. They targeted labor. Wages were to be cut by as much as 25%. Working hours were to be extended. Miners, already among the poorest workers in the country, were told they must accept longer days for less pay to preserve Britain's financial credibility. The response was furious and immediate. Miners understood something the Treasury refused to acknowledge. This was not a market failure, it was a political choice. They were being asked to subsidize a strong pound so that London could retain its prestige. Their suffering was not incidental, it was required. The slogan that emerged captured the mood of an entire class. Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. The government feared the consequences of an immediate showdown. Britain was not ready. Supplies were inadequate. Public opinion was uncertain, so officials bought time. They introduced a temporary subsidy to support coal wages for 9 months, a pause that became known as Red Friday. It was not a solution, it was a delay. Behind the scenes, both sides prepared for war. The government stockpiled coal. Emergency plans were drafted to keep transport and essential services running without miners. Volunteers were quietly recruited to replace striking workers if necessary. Unions, meanwhile, organized solidarity. Miners secured pledges from railway workers and transport unions to stand together if confrontation came. The conflict was no longer industrial, it was political. At the center of it all stood the gold standard, rigid and indifferent. Every attempt to compromise ran into the same wall. The pound could not bend. Any concession to labor threatened the currency peg. Any wage support risked gold outflows. The system allowed no flexibility, no mercy. By early 1926, the subsidy expired. Mine owners reissued their demands. Miners refused. There was no room left to maneuver. What followed was not merely a strike, it was the moment Britain's economic ideology collided head-on with its social reality. A nation that had survived war now faced paralysis from within, and all of it traced back to a single decision: to force the economy to serve the currency no matter the cost. On May 3, 1926, Britain stopped. Trains did not run. Buses stayed in their depots. Ports fell silent. Newspapers failed to print. Over 1.7 million workers walked off the job in what became known as the General Strike of 1926, the largest industrial action in British history. For 9 days, the machinery of a modern state ground almost entirely to a halt. This was not a spontaneous uprising. It was the direct consequence of years of economic pressure applied from above. When the coal subsidy expired, mine owners imposed wage cuts and longer hours. The miners refused. True to their pledges, transport workers, railwaymen, dock workers, printers, and engineers joined them. What began as a dispute over coal wages became a nationwide confrontation over who would pay for Britain's economic choices. The government responded as if facing an insurrection. Emergency powers were activated. Troops were put on standby. A volunteer force drawn largely from the middle and upper classes was mobilized to keep essential services running. University students drove buses, retired officers unloaded ships, clerks replaced railwaymen. The symbolism was unmistakable, one Britain replacing another. At the heart of the state's response was a fierce refusal to compromise. Officials framed the strike not as a negotiation over wages, but as a threat to constitutional order. The gold standard hovered invisibly over every decision. Any concession, they believed, would undermine confidence in the pound. Winston Churchill, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer and overseeing the government's propaganda effort, described the strike as a challenge to parliamentary democracy itself. The language hardened. Neutrality vanished. Yet beneath the rhetoric, the reality was bleak. The country could not endure this indefinitely. Food supplies tightened. Power generation faltered. Public anxiety grew not about revolution, but about daily survival. Union leaders began to panic. They had hoped solidarity would force negotiation. Instead, they faced a government willing to endure paralysis rather than risk devaluing the currency. Worse, they feared the strike was slipping beyond their control, drifting toward illegality and political confrontation they were unprepared to win. After just 9 days, the Trades Union Congress capitulated. The strike was called off without securing a single guarantee for the miners. It was a devastating reversal. The miners, abandoned, stayed out alone for months. Families starved. Communities sold possessions, burned furniture for heat, and watched their children weaken. Eventually, arithmetic won. They returned to work under worse conditions than before. The government declared victory. But what had really been preserved was not stability, only the illusion of it. The government had won. The strike was broken. Wages were cut. The pound remained fixed to gold. By every measure that mattered to the financial elite, order had been restored. And yet, nothing improved. From 1926 onward, Britain entered a strange and punishing limbo, neither collapsing nor recovering. The promised rewards of discipline never arrived. There was no export boom, no industrial renaissance, no return to prosperity. Instead, the economy stagnated. Unemployment remained stubbornly high, rarely dropping below 1 million. In some industrial regions, joblessness became permanent. Towns built around coal, steel, and shipbuilding slowly emptied of purpose. Men stood idle for years, not months, watching skills decay and hope erode. The problem was structural, and the gold standard made it impossible to solve. With the pound fixed at an overvalued rate, British goods were still too expensive abroad. Wage cuts had reduced costs, but not enough to overcome the currency handicap. Meanwhile, the Bank of England was trapped. To maintain the gold peg, interest rates had to stay high. If rates were lowered to stimulate investment, gold would flow out of London toward higher returns in New York. so credit remained tight. Precisely when industry needed cheap money to modernize, factories could not retool, infrastructure could not be upgraded. New industries struggled to emerge. Britain was frozen in place. Elsewhere, the world moved on. The United States surged through the late 1920s, fueled by cheap credit and expanding consumer demand. France and Belgium having devalued their currencies after the war saw exports recover and industry revive. Germany, despite political turmoil, modernized rapidly. Britain alone clung to orthodoxy. Policymakers insisted the suffering was buying credibility. They believed that patience would be rewarded, that confidence would return, that capital would flow back to London. They spoke of the long view, while entire communities collapsed in the short term. But credibility without growth is empty. The gold standard demanded constant restraint. Every attempt at stimulus was treated as heresy. Government spending was limited. Welfare was pared back. Public investment was avoided out of fear of deficits and gold losses. The economy was not allowed to heal, was ordered to endure. This prolonged stagnation had consequences far beyond balance sheets. It reshaped politics, deepened regional inequality, and planted the seeds of extremism. While the South and parts of London limped along, the industrial North descended into despair. The real tragedy was not just that Britain suffered, it was that the suffering achieved nothing. The country had endured years of pain to defend a system that delivered neither prosperity nor stability. And as the global economy edged toward a far greater crisis, Britain entered the storm already weak and still chained to gold, still unable to act. The gold standard did not fail gradually. It failed suddenly, and it failed publicly. In October 1929, the Wall Street crash sent shockwaves through the global economy. What followed was not merely an American crisis, it was a systemic one. International credit froze, global trade collapsed, capital retreated toward safety. For Britain, already weakened by a decade of self-imposed stagnation, the shock was devastating. Exports fell sharply. Unemployment surged past 2 million. Tax revenues collapsed, even as welfare demands increased. The government faced a grim arithmetic: falling income, rising obligations, and a currency system that allowed no flexibility. Under the gold standard budget, deficits were dangerous. They undermined confidence. They threatened gold reserves. To remain on gold, Britain had to balance its books even in the middle of a depression. Foreign investors were watching closely. British banks had lent heavily to Europe, especially to Germany and Austria. When continental banks began to fail in 1931, those assets froze. Suddenly, London owed money it could not collect. Confidence evaporated. Then came the run. International investors, doubting Britain's ability to maintain the gold peg, began converting pounds into gold and shipping it abroad. Every day, millions drained from the Bank of England's vaults. The governor, overwhelmed by the pressure, suffered a nervous collapse. The government faced an impossible choice. To defend gold, it needed emergency loans from New York and Paris. The terms were brutal. Britain would receive support only if it cut government spending, especially unemployment benefits. The price of saving the currency was to reduce the last lifeline for millions already on the edge of starvation. The cabinet split. Half refused to impose the cuts. They argued that defending gold at the expense of the poor was morally indefensible. The government collapsed. A national government was formed, united by a single objective: save the pound. They raised taxes. They cut benefits. They slashed public sector wages. And it still wasn't enough. In September 1931, something unprecedented happened. Sailors in the Royal Navy mutinied, not violently, but decisively after learning their pay would be cut. The symbol of British power itself refused to comply. Financial markets panicked. If Britain could not control its navy, it could not control its currency. The gold reserves hemorrhaged. Within days, they were nearly gone. On September 20th, 1931, Britain surrendered. The government announced that the pound would no longer be convertible into gold. The gold standard, defended through years of suffering, was abandoned in a single statement. The elite braced for disaster. They expected chaos, inflation, riots, collapse. None came. Instead, something remarkable happened. The economy finally began to breathe. On the morning after Britain abandoned the gold standard, the world did not end. The pound fell quickly and decisively from $4.86 to roughly $3.40. almost exactly where it had traded a decade earlier. To the orthodox economists who had defended gold at all costs, this was supposed to trigger catastrophe. Instead, it triggered relief. There was no hyperinflation. Shops stayed open. Food arrived. Wages did not collapse overnight. Life continued not perfectly, but without panic. The feared loss of confidence failed to materialize. More importantly, the economy began to move again. A cheaper pound transformed Britain's position in global trade. Overnight, British exports became competitive. Goods that had been priced out of foreign markets suddenly found buyers again. Orders increased. Factories reopened, lines that had been idle for years. The Bank of England, finally freed from defending an arbitrary peg, slashed interest rates. Cheap credit flowed into the economy. Investment, long suppressed, returned. This did not produce a miracle, but it produced momentum. New industries grew where old ones had been strangled. Automobiles, aviation, chemicals, and consumer electronics expanded. Housing boomed in the South and Midlands as affordable mortgages fueled suburban development. Employment rose not everywhere, not evenly, but measurably. Britain recovered from the Great Depression faster than many countries, including the United States. Crucially, it did so because it abandoned gold before others followed. The irony was painful. Nearly everything the government had feared came from leaving gold failed to occur. And nearly everything critics had warned would result from staying on gold had already happened. The gold standard had not protected Britain's strength. It had delayed its recovery, yet the damage was permanent. A decade of stagnation had hollowed out Britain's industrial heartlands. Regions sacrificed in the 1920s did not benefit fully from the recovery of the 1930s. 2. Britain's emerged one modestly prosperous, one permanently scarred. The social fabric had frayed. The suffering endured to defend the pound had achieved nothing lasting. The system it protected collapsed anyway, only after inflicting unnecessary pain on millions. The lesson was unavoidable. A currency is not an end in itself, it is a tool. When policy treats symbols as sacred and people as expendable, it destroys the very foundations of national power. Britain remained a great power for a while longer, but the financial spine of the empire had cracked. When the next war came, Britain would fight it, not as the world's banker but as a debtor, dependent on American support. The gold standard did not merely fail, it nearly ended the United Kingdom as an economic power. The gold standard did not collapse because Britain was weak. It collapsed because Britain refused to adapt. The men who defended it were not villains. They were patriots shaped by an older world one, in which credibility meant gold, discipline meant pain, and prestige meant fixed numbers on a ledger. To them, abandoning gold felt like surrender, like admitting decline. But history delivered a harsher verdict. By clinging to a symbol, Britain sacrificed the substance of its power. It protected the appearance of strength while eroding the reality beneath it. Factories decayed, skills were lost, communities were broken. And when Britain finally let go of gold, it discovered that the suffering had been unnecessary. The mistake was not technical, it was philosophical. British leaders confused money with wealth. They treated the currency as the source of national strength rather than a reflection of it. They assumed that if the pound looked strong, the country would be strong. The opposite was true. A nation's real power lies in its people, their productivity, health, skills, and capacity to adapt. When policy crushes these foundations to defend a financial abstraction, the abstraction eventually collapses anyway. This lesson reshaped the modern world. The failure of Britain's gold experiment vindicated thinkers like John Maynard Keynes, whose ideas would dominate post-war economics. Governments learned, sometimes reluctantly, that economies do not self-heal under punishment, that employment matters more than exchange rate purity, that flexibility is strength, not weakness. The post-World War II financial system was built specifically to avoid repeating Britain's mistake. Fixed exchange rates were made adjustable. Governments were given room to respond to crises. Gold was pushed aside. And yet, the temptation remains. Every generation faces its own version of the gold standard, a rule, a metric, a symbol, treated as sacred even when it no longer serves reality. Balanced budgets during depressions, austerity during collapse. Currency pegs defended at the cost of society. The names change, the logic does not. Britain's experience stands as a warning written across an entire decade of lost potential. It shows how intelligent nations can trap themselves by mistaking discipline for wisdom, rigidity for strength. Empires do not fall only through invasion. Sometimes they strangle themselves slowly, deliberately out of fear of admitting that the world has changed. The gold standard nearly ended the United Kingdom, not because it failed as a system, but because Britain believed in it long after it had stopped making sense. History is unforgiving to that kind of loyalty, and it always sends the bill to the people least able to pay.